Welcome to PRI's podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this episode, Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and I chat with Lance Izumi, Senior Director of PRI Center for Education. Despite all the money that's gone into education, both at the state and national levels, educational performance in the U.S. continues to rank poor to mediocre when stacked up with other industrialized nations. California in particular has a desperate problem. In a 50-state analysis by the magazine Education Week, California ranked 41st in conditions that help children succeed, 39th in school finance, and 30th in achievement. But with a president and a secretary of education who are strong proponents of school choice, we have reason to hope for significant improvements in the next few years. Lance has a new brief, An American Education Agenda, where he offers 15 reforms, 5 at the national level and 10 at the state level, that will help raise the performance of America's students. In this episode, Lance gives an overview of those reforms. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to PRI's podcast, Lance.
Thank you very much, Ro. I really appreciate you and Tim having me on the podcast this week.
So, Lance, you've just released what we're calling An American Education Agenda. Talk about your thinking behind the study and what will our listeners learn when they read a copy?
Well, thanks, Ro, for the question. At the Center for Education here at the Pacific Research Institute, where I'm the senior director, over the last umpteen years, we've been making various recommendations to improve education at various levels, both state, local, and federal. And so what we decided to do was that we needed to kind of bring all our knowledge and wisdom that we've built up all over the years together into one publication. So we've put together this American Education Agenda, which includes 5 of our most important recommendations for the federal government and 10 recommendations for state and local governments. I think it's important to realize that, given that we're doing twice as many recommendations for state and local governments, it's also a statement as to, where the decision-making, policy-making really should lie here in America. Those decisions as it relates to education should optimally be done at the state and local levels, which are closest to the people, and minimize as much as possible federal involvement.
Lance, let's focus on some of your federal education reforms first. One of your recommendations calls for reducing the size of the bureaucracy at the U.S. Department of Education. And I know this is an area where the Trump administration is already starting to work. So how would reforming the Department of Education's operations improve our children's education? And what do you make of Secretary DeVos's efforts in this area?
Well, that's a very good set of questions, Tim. President Trump, when he came into office, one of the first executive orders that he signed was an order directing Secretary DeVos, who's the Secretary of Education, to look at the federal regulations as they relate to education and to see where they are overburdensome on state and local education policy makers, and to basically pull back on these regulations where they are impinging on the effectiveness of those state and local agencies. Secretary DeVos has 300 days to make these recommendations, and so there's been an internal task force at the U.S. Department of Education which has been formed, in which they're going to come up with a set of recommendations. And I think that's a very good thing that they're doing, and I'm sure that a lot of good recommendations will come out of them, and hopefully they'll be implemented. I think in terms of the size of the Department of Education, a lot of our listeners will remember that back in President Reagan's day, he made the promise or campaign promise that he wanted to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. Well, as we all know, that didn't come to pass. But there are things that the federal government can do under President Trump, if not to eliminate the Department of Education, certainly to reduce its size. In my recommendation on reducing and shrinking the size of the U.S. Department of Education, I cite numerous programs that can be either eliminated or that can be offloaded to different other agencies. So, for example, you can send student loans, to the Treasury Department. You can send the Title I program, which is focused on low-income kids, to HHS as maybe a block grant. You can send vocational education to the Department of Labor. There are lots of other places in the government that would be, natural repositories for a lot of U.S. Department of Ed programs now. And, you just have to look, for example, at the school lunch program, which is not administered by the U.S. Department of Ed, but is actually administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So there is precedent for that. And, by doing that, by offloading these programs, having other departments look after them, which in many cases are more commonsensical places for them, then, I think that you can reduce the size of the U.S. Department of Education and also, reduce its interference in education at the state and local levels.
Lance, you've written and lectured, what is it now, maybe 2 decades on the importance of school choice. One of your recommendations in the agenda is to act a new tax credit for scholarships to empower parents to utilize school choice. Can we really have true school choice if parents can't afford to send their children to the best school possible?
No, that's an important point, Ro. Unless you have expansive school choice, which allows, most people in this country to have a tool in which they can use to take their child out of either poor performing or unsatisfactory public school that they're attending and place them in an alternative, whether that is a private independent school, a religious school, or some other form of schooling. Unless you have that tool, whether it's an education savings account, a tax credit, or a voucher, some type of tool, you're not going to be able to give those parents the type of choices that they need in order to make sure that their kid receives the education that they want them to receive. And I think that's one of the really important things that we've been emphasizing at the Center for Education over so many years is that each parent and their child has that right to have the best education possible, regardless of who that provider is, whether it's a public school or whether it's a private school or some other type of schooling option. In the agenda, we make a recommendation for a tax credit that the federal government can give. There are a number of different ways that a tax credit can be fashioned, but the important thing is to be able to give those parents this ability to, whether it's that tax credit or any other option, use it to send their child to a better schooling option.
Lance, at the state level, your very first recommendation in your agenda is to repeal and replace the very hotly debated Common Core program, which is something that President Trump supports. So for our listeners who may not be following the issue, could you give us maybe the 30-second view of what is Common Core and why is it so controversial? And then how would our children's education be improved by repealing and replacing Common Core?
During the campaign, one of the education issues that President Trump always brought up at his campaign stops was repealing and replacing Common Core. Common Core is a national set of education standards and testing systems. And so basically it's a top-down system that basically homogenizes education throughout the United States, so that prior to Common Core we had individual state standards and testing systems. Now, these have been replaced by this single set of national standards and the testing systems aligned to that. So unfortunately for places, let's say like California, those standards are actually lower than what the previous standards were here in California. For example, under the previous state standards, you had the requirement that all students take algebra in the 8th grade. Under Common Core, students don't have to take algebra until the 9th grade. Well, what does that mean for students? Well, that means that, if you follow the natural progression of math courses, those students under Common Core will not be able to take calculus in their senior year in high school, which puts them at a great disadvantage in being college ready for higher education. So you've actually had this dumbing down of standards and therefore learning in the classroom. And I think it's not surprising that when you look at the national test scores, for example, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, that you see declines in both reading and mathematics since Common Core was implemented. And so I think what we need to do is to follow up on what President Trump had actually said in his speeches, is to actually repeal and replace those Common Core standards in the individual states. States have the opportunity to do that. There's nothing that stops them from, eliminating the Common Core within their states and then putting in, much higher standards. Like, for example, Massachusetts had been widely viewed as having one of the best state standards prior to Common Core. Nothing to stop other states from resurrecting those standards and implementing them in some form in their own states. So I think that, what we need to do here in the states is for them to get control back over their own standards and tests so that, the people in those states have greater influence on changing things if that's necessary.
Lance, you also recommend improving state charter school laws to make it easier to establish new charter schools in communities across the country. Talk about the importance of charter schools to the school choice options available for parents and students.
Well, charter schools are a hugely important part of the school choice menu, so to say. charter schools are publicly funded schools, but they have less onerous regulations and red tape tied to them. But in exchange for that greater freedom, they have greater accountability. Could have a regular traditional public school that could go years and years and years, producing terrible results, and nothing ever happens to them. They never close down. Teachers and principals in the system never change. Whereas at a charter school, if you do not meet the accountability standards, then whoever authorized the charter school, whether it's the local school district board or whether it's the state board, they have the option of closing the school down, not renewing the charter because of poor performance. So there is a lot more accountability there. And so, if you look at the most recent national research on charter schools, you find that, they either perform as good or better than traditional public schools in both reading and mathematics. So they're really important, and, we really need to, expand the number of charter schools available. And in the education agenda that I've written, I lay out while most states have charter laws that allow charter schools, they're of varying quality, so that you have some states like Maryland which make it very difficult for charters to be established, and there are all kinds of different regulations and problems within that law. And so those types of problems, as I point out in the study, can be changed and amended so that you have much better performing charter laws, and then therefore you have much better performing charter schools and greater availability of those schools for students and parents.
Lance, a recent court case in California, the Vergara case, garnered national attention for the focus that it brought on how teacher tenure, layoff, and removal processes are really hurting educational opportunities for kids, especially those in poor communities. The trial court judge in the case even said that the conditions brought about by these policies, quote, shock the conscience. In your agenda, you recommend reforming these policies. How would reforming these policies improve the education of kids, particularly in poor and minority communities?
Well, that Vergara case, Tim, was a huge, important case that, even though it was brought in a California state court, had potential national ramifications, because what it was involved a group of poor minority students who said that they were receiving a wholly inadequate education here in California, and that it was because of teacher tenure laws that kept bad and ineffective teachers in the classroom despite the fact that they were not improving the learning of children. It was because there were terrible dismissal laws that kept, again, these bad teachers in the classroom that, who should have been dismissed because of anything from ineffective teaching to actual criminal activity. And then also you had layoff policies that protect senior teachers and would actually dismiss younger teachers who were actually better performing teachers, but because they were hired last, that they were the first ones out of the door when it came to the pink slips and the layoffs. And so the reform of these policies are hugely important to improving the education for children in the classroom. I mean, if you want a child to perform well, the first thing you really need to do is to have an effective teacher in front of the classroom. And because there's lots of research data over many years showing the impact of ineffective teachers on students, and which have huge impacts on them for many, many years, not just for the year that they're in that class, but for many years out and through their lives. While the judge, as Tim mentioned, ruled in favor of the children and said that these California laws involving tenure and layoffs and dismissal were unconstitutional based on the state constitution, even though that was overturned in a state appellate court. States have this ability on their own, through their own legislatures, to be able to overturn those laws. In fact, here in California, a number of legislators put forward a package of legislation proposals to overturn those laws here in California. Well, those same types of legislation can be promoted in other states as well. And we don't have to always look to the courts to do our dirty work. We actually have to have our legislators do basically what they were paid for, and is to look after the interests of their constituents and not the special interests who unfortunately control the public school system.
Lance, you've written extensively over the years on blended learning, including a book called Moonshots in Education, which you co-wrote with the author Esther Wojcicki. One of your recommendations on the agenda is to improve the environment for digital learning to succeed. In your view, how would expanding the use of classroom technology improve student outcomes?
What I've shown in several of my books, Moonshots in Education, as you mentioned, Ro. Also, too, I've had another book called Short Circuited, plus other shorter articles, is that digital education, which means the use of computers in the classroom, especially in models such as blended learning, where you have part of the education of students done in a regular brick and mortar classroom, part of it done using computers, whether that's in the school or somewhere outside the school, that these models have proven very effective in improving the performance of students because they can individualize and personalize the learning for those students, so that a student who may be at a somewhat lower level in a classroom, well, the software now has developed to the point where it can help that student meet that student at where they are and raise that student's performance to grade level and beyond, if that's where the student can go. And that is one of the great things about these types of digital learning systems, is that they're based not so much on chronological age of the students, but basically the mastery of the students. Where can that student go, despite the fact that they might be 10 years old? Maybe they might be able to do the work of a 14-year-old. You're not imprisoned within the confines of these expectations of these somewhat arbitrary grade levels. And so I've gone to places like Grimway Academy, which is a charter school down in the Central Valley here in California, and seen how the blended learning model there has done incredible work in raising the achievement of students from low income, Hispanic, often immigrant backgrounds, in where they're scoring at the 80% proficiency level, at least on the former California state tests. And so I think there's a lot of promise here, and what we need to do is to be able to provide those students not only with material, but also with trained professionals, in this case the teachers and others, who will be able to use that material to its highest effectiveness for these students.
Along the lines of that talk of preparing teachers, you've also called for more support and education to be given to both new and veteran teachers so they can better serve the individual needs of students. How are current teacher prep programs failing to prepare our teachers to meet these always evolving demands of the classroom?
Well, sadly, not very well, Tim. If you look at my section in the American Education Agenda on teacher preparation programs, and it's very disheartening, because what you find is that certainly in areas such as the basic areas of math and reading, the preparation programs are coming up very short. If you were to compare preparation programs here in the United States with those in high-performing countries across the world, we certainly fall way short in terms of the type of preparation, let's say in mathematics, where the teachers are not getting the substantive education in being able to teach children how to do their math, certainly to the level that we all expect them to be at. And also, too, I would also mention that if you look at my book, Moonshots, which was previously mentioned, Moonshots in Education, my section of that book was focused on the lack of teacher preparation in these areas of digital learning. And, you take a country like Singapore, where all teachers are prepared to go into the classroom and engage their students with digital learning techniques. And you compare that to the United States, where you're lucky if 5 to 10% of teachers are so prepared. When we're entering this new age of education technology and it's coming use in the classroom, and yet we don't have the professionals who are ready to make use of it, I think that you combine that with the lack of preparation in the basic subjects, and we have a real crisis here on our hands. And we often hear about the teacher shortage. It's not a teacher shortage necessarily that we have. We have a shortage of teachers who are really prepared to do the work in the classroom that is going to raise the achievement of the students to the level that taxpayers and parents expect it to be.
Lance, one area that's very troubling to think about is the lack of safety in the classroom and on campus. I think this is very underreported. Safety issue can mean everything from sexual predators, teachers as sexual predators, or students facing violence on the campus. In most cases, campus administrators do very little to ensure student safety, and even more troubling is they don't like to report it. What policy changes do you think need to be made to ensure our schools are providing a safe learning environment for every child?
No, I think that's absolutely right, Ro. You give a good synopsis of things. First of all, we have a huge problem on our hands, America's classrooms and school campuses. If you look at the most recent federal statistics, you find that there were over 750,000 violent incidents that occurred on America's public school campuses. That means that 65% of public schools reported those sorts of crimes, which is a huge number. So we're not just talking about classrooms in areas that like the Bronx or South Central LA or places where we think there might be problems, but we're talking about schools all across America where there are problems. And so therefore we need to be looking at the types of policies that schools and states are using in order to combat this crime wave that's going across this nation. And unfortunately, if you look at what schools and states and also the federal government have been pushing, many of the of them have been pushing policies that instead of getting tough on this problem, have actually sought to pull back in terms of discipline policies. You've had the federal government under President Obama push out a directive to the schools saying that to reduce their suspensions if they have a disparate impact upon minority students, specifically African American students, even if those policies on paper are race neutral. And then you have that all trickling down to the classroom, where you have schools where the students are basically out of control because nothing can be done to them. They've reduced the ability their ability to discipline students, so the students unfortunately are in a kind of a Lord of the Flies situation. They're running the show opposed to the people who are hired to run our schools, and so therefore very little learning is taking place in the classroom. I point out to the research that shows that if you have one disruptive student in a classroom, it has a huge impact on the learning of students and also has a negative impact on the behavior of other students. So it has this whole ripple effect. Our inability to gain control of our classrooms is having this terrible academic impact on students, in addition to the concerns about the very safety of children that obviously first motivates parents.
So Lance, we know you had the great opportunity to discuss your previous book, The Corrupt Classroom, with Education Secretary Betsy DeVos at her office in Washington. So for your next book, we're going to imagine that you have the opportunity to have an audience with President Trump. So if you're sitting at the White House with the president, what one reform from your American education agenda would you recommend to him that you think would have the greatest positive impact on our children's education, and why?
President Trump, I think, had it right during the campaign when he focused on school choice. I really do think that all of the recommendations that I make in the American education agenda are important, but ultimately, if we had school choice, greater choice for parents, like, whether to send their kid to the public or private school of their choice, if we had that in America for all of America's children, then so many of our problems would decrease or even disappear. And I think that the president continues to say that school choice is an important part of his agenda in education. There are things that the federal government can do, as I point out in my agenda. But also, too, I do think that the president is uniquely positioned to use his bully pulpit in order to push choice throughout this country. You just have to look at huge crowds that the president draws at every stop he continues to make, and choice is part of his speech that makes a huge impact. And I think that President and Secretary DeVos realize that most choice policies will be enacted at the state and local level, but certainly the continued rhetorical backing by the president would have huge impact, I think, certainly over time, in both educating people as to why choice is important, but and also putting pressure on states and local governments to then enact those choice programs.
Similarly, Lance, if you had the chance to have an audience with Governor Brown or California's next governor, what one reform at the state level would you recommend that would have the greatest positive impact for California students, and why?
Well, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to say that choice is the most important thing. Whereas President Trump, in many ways, as I said, would have to use his bully pulpit as opposed to being able to enact, a lot of actual programs in order to support choice. When you get down to the state and local level, you have a lot greater opportunity to enact choice programs. I mean, most of the school choice programs in this country have been enacted at the state and local level. The first voucher program was enacted in Wisconsin. We have near universal education savings accounts programs in Nevada and Arizona. So you have lots of programs being enacted, but there could be a lot more. And certainly California could do a lot better. Yes, we have charter schools, but we certainly don't have education savings account program like Nevada does, or other choice tools that other states have. And so I think that Governor Brown, or whoever the next governor will be, needs to look at giving Californians this opportunity to choose the best school for their child. And I think what's interesting is that even though California is viewed as being this very deep blue state, in recent polling data, you find that large majorities of Californians support basically universal vouchers for all California kids. And in fact, you're talking 60, 70, 3/4 of the people polling saying that they support vouchers for school choice. And in fact, if you look at certain communities like Latino or African Americans, I mean, those totals go up to 80% or more. And so I think that people in California realize that the schools that they have right now, the public schools run by the government, are not providing the type of education that their children need and deserve, and that they need an option to go someplace else because they want the best for their child to succeed in this world, and government is not providing that foundation that they need in order to do so.
So, Lance, now that we're in this holiday period and winter time, we always like to end these podcasts by asking our guests to share their favorite adult beverage, but you're not an adult beverage drinker, so what is your favorite winter beverage that you could recommend for our listeners?
Well, Tim, in many ways I'm still a traditionalist, so I have to say eggnog. When I toast at New Year's, if I don't figure on maybe doing my one sip of Bailey's Irish Cream a year, I will actually get some eggnog and toast with that. And so I like eggnog, usually the low-fat, non-fat version of it. And so it gives me more room to eat a lot of other things. So I'm an eggnog time.
Thanks, Lance.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Lance Izumi and to Tim Anaya. To download a copy of An American Education Agenda, visit our website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1. That's the number 1. Also, check out our blog Right by the Bay on our website at pacificresearch.org. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.